Welcome back. I hope that you're enjoying the series. I know that the last teaching on Ahaz is a little and why do we even need to know about Ahaz? It's not Ahaz we need to know about, it's his son Hezekiah. But in order to understand Hezekiah, I felt like we needed to get a concept of who his father, King Ahaz, was, because it was Ahaz that led Judah down the path of unrighteousness. And so now we see his son Hezekiah come to the kingship, king of Judah, and he is a righteous king. He is the 13th king of Judah. His reign was between 715 and 686 BC. As I said, he was a righteous king. He's mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, and he strengthened Israel in devotion to the Father in heaven. Isn't that interesting? He strengthened Israel in the devotion to God, whereas his father tore it down. His mom's name was Avi, daughter of Zechariah, and he made an alliance with the king of Assyria so that he could be free of the wars with the kings of Aram and Israel. His father, his dad aligned with Aram, Damascus, and Israel, Ephraim, and it was not positive. And so Hezekiah, aligns with the king of Assyria. 1 Kings 18 through 20, 2 Chronicles 29 through 32, and Isaiah 37 through 39 cover the reign of Hezekiah. And aren't you glad we're not going to read all those scriptures today? But if you want to know who this king is, that's a really good way to look. Also to look in Josephus. Josephus has some nice things to say about him. Not always nice, but things to say. It was a tumultuous reign in many ways, with many ups and downs. As I said, he wanted to restore righteousness to the kingdom. He's the first king in the house of David to carry out true reform of the Israelite cult that resulted in the elevation of the temple of Jerusalem to the status of the central shrine of the kingdom. Now, what do I mean about the central shrine? There were many altars around Israel. And those altars initially had been established prior to the building of the temple. And they were for convenience sake, distance. People couldn't always come up to Jerusalem. And the fact at that time, when those were set up, the tabernacle was at Shiloh, which is even further north. And so they established these, if you will, regional altars where people could go and make their offerings and their sacrifices and that kind of thing. And then when Solomon finally built the temple in Jerusalem, then that was to be the central focus, and all these other altars would come down. Well, that never happened. And there were also idol altars in close proximity, and sometimes people got to where they would go to these altars, not the idol altars, but the God's altars, and they would go there to worship in a move to improve themselves and to strengthen themselves, not necessarily to worship God, but it was about self-elevation. They wanted to be lifted up. And he didn't like that. He wanted the altar in Jerusalem, the temple, to be the central altar for all of Israel. And so he began tearing down those altars. Now, the altars that were for idols, he destroyed. But the altars that had been raised in righteousness originally, so that people could worship God regionally, he took down, but he took them down with respect and didn't destroy them. I don't know what he did do with them, but he took them away with respect. So then we wanted to look at them. King Hezekiah's righteousness was especially pronounced because he was raised in a spiritually corrupt palace and lived in a time when the atmosphere was polluted by idolatry. Well, we just talked about those idols. Can you imagine? Well, I suppose some of you can imagine growing up in a household where dad is whacked, really crazy, and he's doing everything he can against God, everything he can to make God angry, everything he can to just be vile in the face of anything holy and righteous. We talked about King Ahaz was tearing down everything and forbidding Torah study. And here his son comes along and he increases Torah study. Somewhere in that castle, someone had to have been teaching Hezekiah righteousness. Someone, maybe it was his mom, maybe it was his grandparents, we really don't know. But someone was talking to him about the things of God. Maybe it was one of the prophets was talking to him. We don't know. But we do know that someone was reaching out to him. It's important to remember that here that Israel has already been divided into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom consisted of the 10 tribes. The southern kingdom are the 2 tribes of Benjamin and Judah. Now, we don't know for sure what the altar looked like. The altar I'm talking about here is the altar that King Ahaz had changed after he'd gone to Damascus and saw their altar. We don't know for sure what it looked like, except it was not designed by Abraham, or not the altar that God gave to Abraham and that Solomon had built. The high places had been established prior to the building of Jerusalem. I told you about that. The Nehushtan, that's Nehushtan, and yes, that's in your Bible. The Nehushtan was one of the things that had to be torn down. Well, now you say, well, what was the Nehushtan? Well, do you remember out in the desert when the Jews were in the desert that 40 years? And one time they made God angry. Do you remember that? And so what he did was he sent fiery serpents among them, and they were bit or stung, however you say it, by the serpents. And some of them were dying from this. And so Moses quickly made a bronze serpent, and he raised it up on a pole. And now, I believe, my own little thought process, I believe this pole had to be like this, like a T-shape, because there had to be some way of attaching that serpent. Maybe they just nailed it on, I'm not sure. But anyhow, the whole idea was that if the people would look upon that serpent, then they would be healed of the serpent bite they had just received. Well, so people have begun worshiping this serpent, bronze serpent, was in the temple. They brought it along. It was one of those things. It was a religious artifact from the desert time, and they brought it up to Jerusalem for the temple. And so the people had begun worshiping it, and they were actually burning incense in front of it. I mean, why don't you just go burn incense in front of your car? So anyhow, he took that down. But when he called it Nehushtan. Nehushtan means just a bronze thing. He defamed it first. He just said, it's just a piece of bronze. That's all. And he took it down and he destroyed it. Now, that's one of the things that he did that was so righteous. We don't know what he did with it other than destroyed it. And God responded in kindness, giving him success in all his undertakings. God appreciated what he was doing. Hezekiah removed the altars, he took down the Nehushtan, and he began cleaning house. In Deuteronomy 16 verses 21, it appears that the closing of the high places had been inspired by the altar law of Deuteronomy 16, 21, and 22, where they are told that they're not to set up any type of pole or ashtoreth. The time frame, these were the years immediately after the collapse of the northern kingdom of Israel, when it was captured by the Assyrians and sent into exile. Prophets had warned, but the people hadn't heard. Warnings. Are we hearing the warnings today? How many warnings are there out there for us today? Do we know? There are a lot of them. Some of them I believe, and some of them I think, well, what ship did you get off of? You know. But there are warnings, and we have to ferret them out. First of all, if it doesn't line up with the Word of God, don't pay attention to it. If it's of God, it will line up with His Word. So if someone is saying, thus saith the Lord, listen to what they have to say, write it down, do whatever you need to do, check it out with the Word. And if it's not compatible with the word, or if you had that witness in your spirit, pitch it, shred it, do whatever it is you need to do with it, but don't obey it. But obey what you really know is from God, and if it's from God, it will line up with the word. Little sermonette there. So the word says, in that day, well, I better go back and see what I'm talking about here. Prophets had warned, but they hadn't heard. In that day, declares the Lord, that I will cut off your horses from among you and destroy your chariots. I will also cut off the cities of your land and tear down all your fortifications. I will cut off sorceries from your hand, and you will have fortune tellers no more. Wow, do I look forward to that day. Now you can dial a fortune teller. I mean, give me a break. Call me up. I won't charge you. I will cut off your carved images and your sacred pillars from among you, so that you will no longer bow down to the work of your hands. I will root out your Asherim from among you and destroy your cities. The message was clear. The destruction of the northern kingdom had been an intense object lesson, and Hezekiah trusted the Lord and followed him in many ways. This leads up to one of the greatest miracles in the history of Israel, in the history of the Jewish people. The king of Assyria surfaced again and was making demands, this time on King Hezekiah, just as his predecessor had done to his father, King Ahaz. It's 14 years after Hezekiah became king of Judah. 6 years after the northern kingdom, that of Assyria, of Israel, the 10 tribes, are defeated by the Assyrian army and led into captivity. So, I mean, these guys know that there was a lot of stuff happening at the hands of the Assyrian army. So there's reason to be fearful. Reason to tremble in your boots, I guess, if you will. And so Hezekiah prepares for battle by sealing the wells and the water supply outside the city to deny water to the Assyrian army. And he built walls and fortifications around the city. Okay, how did he have time to do that? He didn't have satellite pictures. He didn't have drones. He didn't have a military intelligence system that told him that, hey, the Assyrians are coming. But what he did do was he bought himself some time. And as he bought that time, he sent his guys out to build the Salome Tunnel, or what we call as the Hezekiah Tunnel. It's a water tunnel carved underneath the city of David in Jerusalem. Now, if you've been to Israel, then you know that water is a huge thing in Israel. It's just scarce. The main source of water, fresh water, is the Sea of Galilee, and then there's an aquifer, and other than that, they have the salt water of the Mediterranean and the foul water of the Dead Sea. So the water supply is precious in Israel, and it was then as well. So there was a spring that ran through the city, and there were some wells. However, if the enemy got his hands on that spring and he blocked it up, then he could basically thirst out, deny the city of water, and eventually they would surrender for lack of water. Or they could get access into the city through the spring because it came under the walls. Well, Hezekiah saw what was coming, and so he went out and he had his military barricade the spring and build a wall around it while they tunneled through the mountain. And so they had guys tunneling from this direction and guys tunneling from this direction. And today, you can go into the Hezekiah tunnel and it still holds water. And so there are a couple times that it does this. And so I don't know, nobody knows for sure how they had the tunnel engineered to where it would meet, but they figured it out. And there's a theory that somebody up above was tapping or something, making sounds that the guys could follow. But there are the correction spots, and the tunnel is narrow. I mean, I don't go into the tunnel because I'm claustrophobic. I don't like that. But there are places where the water is pretty deep, places where it's pretty shallow. Makes me think of that cave that those kids were just pulled out of in Thailand, and wasn't that a miracle? But anyhow, he built this tunnel to bring the water into the city. On the outside, he hid the spring, and he built a second wall around. He reinforced everything. This took some time. Did not happen overnight. Remember, they didn't have bulldozers to do it with. So, this made it where the troops outside the city had no access to water. So any fresh water that they were able to get had to be brought down from Tiberias, hauled somehow to the point. Now, if you're a besieging army and you've surrounded the city and you're going to be there for a while because you're going to starve them out or whatever it is you're going to do, you need water, and you need a lot of water. The tunnel, the Hezekiah tunnel, is 553 meters long. I did my math on that. It's just over 664 yards, which would be equivalent to 6 2/3 football fields. That's pretty far, you know? It really is. And the tunnel was dug, as I said, from both ends, meeting at the same time in the middle. And interestingly enough, where they met, there's a plaque. It's not fully legible now, but the plaque, you know, it's like rock that was been carved. And where they met, it was all recorded on this plaque. And just talks about them coming from both directions. Hezekiah realizes that Sennacherib's forces are too big for him. Now, Sennacherib is the head of the army that's coming against him. And following the principle that one should not rely on miracles, Hezekiah appealed for peace. Sennacherib replied with an exorbitant demand for tribute. Now, remember, what is this principle? That one should not rely on miracles. Well, that's kind of like saying, well, when my ship comes in, or when I win the lottery, or something like that, or it could be a health miracle. I'm not going to go to the doctor. I'm not going to take my kid to the doctor because I'm going to trust God. Trusting God is a wonderful thing to do, and I fully believe in trusting God. However, I also believe He wants us to do our part. Oftentimes, miracles come through the hands of man. Doctors can sometimes create miracles. So Sennacherib replied with an exorbitant demand for tribute. So, how did Hezekiah handle all this? He handled it 3 ways. He handled it with prayer. He handled it by sending a lavish tribute as demanded. And he handled it by preparing or planning for battle. Now, the plan for the battle was blocking off the water supply, reinforcing the walls of the city, and making the city ready for this. It wasn't exactly an easy thing to do. It had to be done in a hurry. Isaiah 36:1 through 39:8 does a great job of summarizing what happened. Sennacherib is king of Assyria now, and when he learns of King Hezekiah's rebellion, he is at war with Egyptians and Ethiopians, so he sends his henchman, Rabshakeh, with a large military contingency. And this military contingency comes out of Egypt, or not out of Egypt, but they're part of the troop that's not in Egypt where they can be spared. And so he goes to the walls of the city and he begins making loud proclamations. The thing with Rabshakeh is he was Jewish, and nobody knows for sure if he had been captured in one of the wars and therefore had gone ahead and volunteered to be one of the Assyrian army's people, or if he converted to whatever their religion was. Nobody knows for sure, but he spoke, the Bible says Judean, which was the language of the day, was Hebrew. And so he was the messenger sent to Hezekiah, sent to Jerusalem in Judea to make the proclamations that the war is coming. And he brought a message of fear and trembling. Well, what about this fear and trembling thing? Today, in our society, I personally believe there's a lot of fear and trembling going on. It's evil. It's coming from evil. There's been a spirit of evil released on our country just as was then. And this spirit of evil it lies, it proclaims, it goes forth accusing, it does name calling, it points fingers when fingers didn't need to be pointed, and it even gets violent. And I'm thinking of some of the civil organizations that we have today. The civil is not a word that really should apply to them. But you think of some of the organizations like Antifa, I don't know, some of the anti-President Trump movement, some of the anti-Supreme Court movement, some of the anti-fence on the border movement. It's anti, anti, anti. And sometimes I stand back and I look at this thing and I go, really? Do you not realize that in our Constitution, our leaders made provision for us to be safe and secure? And they gave us directions for that, just as the same as God gave directions to the Jews and how they could be safe and secure. And so when I look at some of this stuff going on, I think of people like Reb Sheikah, who came forward. He could speak the language. Oh yeah, he could speak the language. And this morning, I'm staying here. I'm in an Airbnb, and I was trying to get the latest news because I wanted to hear about the children in the cave in Thailand. And I turned on the TV, and I'm hearing these women going blah 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 blah, and they were proclaiming how bad things are. And I'm thinking, really? I mean, bad for them, not for you, and not for me, but for them. And if things are bad for them, then it must be bad for all of you poor people out there who don't have enough knowledge to stand up and speak. And I listened to this for about 32 seconds, and then I thought, I've had enough of that. Clicked it off. But that's what's going on now, is this vitriol, this hatred, this accusing, all the stuff that we're seeing here with Reb Sheikah saying this is going to happen here. He is saying it in such a loud manner that he is hoping that the citizens inside the walled city of Jerusalem would hear. Now I'll tell you this, sound carries very well in Israel. To me, it's one of the many amazing miracles of Israel, is the way the sound carries. It carries so well that now I understand, having been there several times, how Jesus could speak to the 5,000 people on the mountainside without a microphone and they could all hear him. I can understand that now. So sound carries very well. So, you can be in Jerusalem and you can have your doors shut and you can hear children playing on the streets. You can hear not only the traffic noise, there's quite a lot of traffic noise, but you can hear Yossi up the hill hollering at Sammy down the hill or whatever. And they may be half a block apart, but they're hollering at each other because they can hear. Sound transmits. It's not a negative thing. It's just a life thing. And so the sound that we're hearing today in our world is transmitting around the world again and again and again. And it's growing and it's becoming louder, which is what Reb Sheikah was doing here. His sound was coming louder and more vile. And so what we see then is Hezekiah doesn't go to the wall. He sends 3 of his emissaries to the wall to speak to Reb Sheikah. And they ask him, shh, tone it down. Shh, speak in Aramaic. We understand Aramaic. Don't speak in Judean, Hebrew, because you're frightening the people. Well, guess what he wanted to do? He wanted to frighten the people. So he just got louder and longer and proclaiming more damage to them. And he says, Jews, you can surrender now. If you surrender now, we'll let you live in peace. You'll live in comfort until we move you to Assyria. And it was the ideology of the Assyrian government that when they captured a people, that they moved them from wherever they captured them, from their homeland to elsewhere, to Assyria or elsewhere. Because when you uproot someone and you move them, you take their loyalty for that land from them. And they were loyal to Judah. So anyhow, there was this plea from the wall going down. Well, we find out later the reason Hezekiah didn't go was Hezekiah was sick and in bed. Now, isn't that kind of crazy? For the king, to know that you're being attacked, to know that the attack is imminent, and yet you're sick and in bed. Most people would be up and pushing through no matter what. Now this tells us that Hezekiah was really, really sick. And so when his emissaries are there talking to Rabshakeh, and they come back to Hezekiah with the report, he is very upset. Well, enter the prophet. And the prophet says to him, it ain't going to happen. I'm telling you, it's not going to happen. And it's hard to believe that. You know, Ahaz, Hezekiah's dad, didn't trust the prophet, and he didn't trust God. Hezekiah trusts the prophet. Hezekiah trusts God. Hezekiah is very ill. And so we're going to come back in our next section, and we're going to summarize this up and figure out exactly what's going on. We know who the players are. We know what the scenario is. Now we need to figure out what's going to happen and how it's going to happen. It's all there in the Word for us, but we need to learn from it. And I think the thing that we need to learn more than anything is Hezekiah's name means God strengthened him. And we need to learn that in our time of our terrible battles, God does strengthen us if we will trust Him. And trusting is not always easy. We learn it in increments. But I'm telling you right now, you can trust God. He will prevail. And so with that, I'm telling you, Shalom, Shalom, Yerushalayim. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And you will prosper in your soul, and you'll prosper in your spirit as well as in your pocket. Shalom, Shalom.